Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this Leanpub Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Benjamin Kelly. For more than 15 years, Ben has been involved in the software testing industry, working both for startups and for large established enterprises, and he is currently the managing director of House of Test UK. Ben is the author of the Leanpub book Standout, a career guide to gainful employment as a skilled software tester. The book is meant to help you get noticed and land a job in an environment where hundreds of people are applying for roles these days. It also goes into detail with practical strategies for something increasingly important for people from all walks of life, especially those with an independent streak, which is building a personal presence or brand. You can follow Ben on Twitter at Benjamin Kelly and visit his blog at testjutsu.com. In this interview, we're going to talk about Ben's background and career, his professional interests, his book, and at the end we'll talk a little bit about his experience as a self-published author. So thank you, Ben, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I should also say thank you for taking some time out of your evening. It's noon here on the west coast of North America, but it's 8 p.m. in London where Ben is talking from. So thanks for that.
That's no problem.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could, you've been around, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you first became interested in software and computers.
Yeah, sure. So as a kid, I was into computers, but I guess you could say I was into computers the same way that a fat kid's into cake. I was more of a consumer than a creator. So I got through high school, and if you looked at my grades, you probably would have said, "Yeah, that guy's probably really good at video games." And that was about it. But I went to university, did computer science, and dropped out after the first year, and then ended up working for an ISP, an internet service provider, as a sysop, and that's kind of where I really started to gain the really employable skills that I've kind of taken and continued to use. I went to Japan for a year. Went to it was a sports university actually, so a complete sort of break from my career. Then back to university and actually stuck it out, graduated. Still not particularly talented. I was still looking to get into being a programmer, but once I received enough sort of rejection letters to wallpaper a room, a friend of mine suggested to me that perhaps testing might be a way to bridge in, and so I got a job as a tester, and then realized that I was far better at finding how things didn't work than making them work in the first place. That they probably should have been apparent to me far earlier than it was. I enjoyed testing, and then started to get quite good at testing, and then started to meet other testers who were also good, and that's pretty much where I am.
And this was the events you've been describing, apart from Japan, were taking place in Melbourne. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and that's where the vast majority of my education happened.
And was I'm just curious, was computer science something that all the kids were into?
Most of the nerds, yeah. Most of the guys who didn't particularly like playing football or other sports. We sort of used to hang out on the other side of the high school and play Dungeons and Dragons and talk about various nerd minutiae.
Well, I've got some. I think you might be being a little bit overly modest about sports there, because I've got some questions to ask you about that in a few minutes. But one thing I always like to ask people on this podcast, if it's relevant, is if you were starting out, tomorrow in a career like the one you've developed, or if you were giving advice to someone who was embarking on a career like that, would you recommend that they do a full university degree in pursuit of that career?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. And the conclusion that I've reached after, a number of years of study of martial arts is that I think software development and the various disciplines should really be taught as an apprenticeship. So if I was going to suggest that people do anything, it would be look for some sort of education that combines theory and practical with the heavy emphasis on the practical. I think there's nothing wrong with doing 3 years of fundamentals and really learning about how computers work and the underlying systems that sort of hold them all together. But at a university, certainly my university education wasn't what I would call a sort of a good preparation for stepping into how software development's actually done, or how software development actually works in the real world. You tend not to see things like understanding how to describe business value, or how to realize business value, or certainly as a programmer, that the emphasis on testing is very, very slight. At least it was back when I was at school. So I think that the sooner that you can get into coding at the coalface in a place that actually matters in terms of what you deliver, then the sooner you can do that, the better.
You brought up martial arts, and I know that martial arts, and as you just mentioned with the concept of apprenticeship and software testing, are sort of joined themes in your career. And I wanted to ask you how you got into Kendo in the first place.
A bit of a long story, but when I was in primary school, we had a Japanese exchange teacher who was into Kendo and Kenjutsu, and so he did a demonstration, and at that point I was hooked, and so I think it wasn't until I was sort of 17 or so I found a Kendo dojo in my area and started, and been training ever since.
And for those who aren't necessarily aware, can you talk a little bit about what Kendo is and a little bit about its history?
Yeah, so Kendo is the art of the sword, or the way of the sword. It's a Japanese martial art that's approximately 400 years old. And after the Battle of Sekigahara, which was where Ieyasu Tokugawa more or less took over the country, it was kind of the last, or one of the last major battles, certainly for a couple of hundred years. So there were a number of sword schools that existed at that point. They sort of found themselves increasingly with not that much to do. And throughout the years, there's sort of a consolidation of styles. Training with a sword obviously is reasonably dangerous. And so they had different ways of practicing to make that less lethal. But even using a wooden sword is quite dangerous and also potentially fatal. They ended up coming up with what's called a shinai, which is essentially a bamboo sword, or a bamboo representation of a sword. And this was refined over many years from upwards of sort of 32 different slats of bamboo held together by leather strips down to 4, so what we use in modern Kendo today. So there's a kind of a long sort of storied history of Kendo, but there is a sort of there was a practical application to it that perhaps isn't quite so relevant today, but it's certainly deeply rooted in the actual use of the Japanese katana.
Yeah, thanks for that really good history. It's interesting. I happen to know a little bit about this. I read some books edited by Diane Scoss a few years ago, one of which is called Koryo Bujutsu. And I want to ask you about that distinction between the use of jutsu and do, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, which I know you've written about. But just if I can digress, there was another group of people in Japan who ended up with less to do after a certain juncture in history, and that was ninjas. I don't know if have you seen, there's a book called the Bensen Shukai that was published.
I have not seen it.
It's fascinating. It's the first the copy I have is the first English translation of these manuals written by this community, this ninja community. And what happened was they found themselves they were mostly farmers who were called upon to do their ninja duties when required. And then basically, yeah, as you were suggesting, things changed in Japan, including a change in castle architecture, which made getting in a lot harder. And as they complain in the manuals, they would claim that everybody decided they were harder to get into, but it became harder for the ninjas to convince their patrons to hire them to try to break into these impenetrable fortresses.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and so they were basically becoming impoverished, and so they wrote these manuals to give them as a gift to a local potentate to try and convince him, hey, you still need ninjas.
Right.
But of course, they have to. There's just all these contradictions built into what they do. So, for example, one thing they say is, you can't let anybody know that you've hired ninjas or who they are. So you need to let them in the back door to your castle. And by the way, it just so happens that we ninjas know the back doors to your enemies' castles too. And it didn't work, apparently. There's this wonderful artifact of all these manuals, but they sort of continued to decline from at least their moment of glory. But yeah, given this, it's interesting because this distinction between Jutsu and Do, I believe, it is important to be framed in that historical context. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so very briefly, sort of Jutsu is a kind of a martial application. It's if you look at Judo versus Jujutsu, which is probably something most people are familiar with, Jujutsu, it really is a series of techniques in which to rapidly incapacitate another human being in order to either get away or to subdue them. Judo, whilst it has the same sort of or similar sort of techniques and same sort of grappling and throws and so forth, the aspect behind that is really self-improvement through the study of similar art. And the same goes for Kendo. In Kendo, it's improvement of the self through the principles of the study of the sword. And so when you look at other sword arts like various sort of Koryu Iojutsu or Tamesigiri, which is sort of test cutting of a makiwara, which is a kind of a rolled up reed mat, those are quite practical in their application. And certainly with Tamesigiri, you actually end up cutting through something, which is, I'm led to believe, the approximate thickness of a human torso, or the approximate resistance of a human torso. In Kendo, despite the fact that it's a full contact martial art, there's not a lot of actual practical application of sort of crossover between how to use a sword, the way that you strike an opponent. In Kendo isn't so sort of reminiscent of how you might use a katana to do the same sort of thing, despite the fact that the practice has developed from that. So in effect, what you're doing is studying how to face off against an opponent, how to defeat them, how to outthink them. It's essentially a very physical, very rapid game of sort of chess with the ultimate aim to improve yourself as opposed to defeat someone or defeat multiple people.
And in competition, where are there any parts of the body where you're not allowed to strike with the sword, with the weapon?
Yeah, so that would be most places. So there are four main targets in Kendo, which is the head, the wrists, the abdomen, and the throat. Everything else is pretty much out of bounds.
And I imagine these parts are covered. What happens if you and I imagine, so you say abdomen, is that stabbing? I don't know what the correct term would be, but are you allowed to slash there as well?
It is a slashing motion there. The only real sort of thrust is to the throat.
Okay. And what happened? I'm curious. I've done a little bit of competing in other martial arts. What happens in Kendo if you strike in the wrong place?
So if you're in competition and the judges sort of agree that you've done it on purpose, then you might be anything from given a warning or a foul to being disqualified. Depends on how sort of egregious the hit is. If it's clearly unsportsmanlike conduct, then you're done. And
is disarming the opponent part of it as well? I imagine that's the wrist strike is probably part of that.
You can disarm, actually. There are techniques where you can completely knock or flip the opponent's shinai out of their hands, and if you're quick enough, then you can follow up with a strike that will count. If not, then they'll have a half point scored against them.
I see. Okay. And you said you studied at I looked up your profile on LinkedIn. The sports university in Japan was called the International Budo University.
That's right.
What was that experience like?
That was pretty intense. So we were training 6 days a week, between 4 and 6 hours a day. And so that was pretty full on. And for me, that was part of my preparation for an attempt at the World Championships. That particular attempt was unsuccessful, but I was successful on sort of future efforts. And so it was a good grounding for me. It was a great way to spend a year training with people who were studying to become police and high school teachers. It's great to be able to study at a place where you can get a degree in martial arts or a degree in a specific martial art.
And what was the 4 to 6 hours of studies a day like? I mean, did you get up at 6 a.m. and run up the mountain, or?
So there was morning training. So you'd get up at about 6 and you train for an hour. Then you'd probably go and collapse somewhere for an hour and a half, and then there'd be practical classes throughout the day. So those were somewhat less intense. So you'd be practicing techniques and sort of various applications, some kata, and then another 2 hours of training in the evening. And so that was 5 days a week. And I think we had another 3 hours on the Saturday. So they went pretty easy on us on the weekends.
And you just mentioned at least once you represented Australia at the World Kendo Championships, I believe during your was that during your time at the University of Melbourne?
So I was there. It was partially there and shortly thereafter. So 2006 and 2009 was when I represented Australia. So it was in Taipei in Brazil. And
can you talk a little bit about the pressure? I've never competed at anything remotely like that level, but I mean, going into a match is an intense thing, and being in a match is an intense thing.
Yeah.
What was your first match like? I guess is probably a more specific question. How did you feel?
My first match, I was pretty hungry for, actually. I'd been training for such a long time to make the Australian team, and been unsuccessful, I think, in 3 or 4 campaigns. And so I'd had maybe 10 or 11 years of not making the team, and so I was going to make that one count. So I don't remember much about that first match other than it didn't last very long. And I was happy with how that went. But it's funny because when you sort of go in there, you look around and you see every other person in that space has been training for 3+ years with the sole goal in mind to do well in the matches that they're there for. And it is another level of intensity, even from sort of domestic competition. It kind of ratchets up a notch or two. And you have to be on. You have to be prepared. You can't bring anything but your A game, otherwise it's just not good enough. And looking around, you sort of see, particularly with the Japanese team, also to an extent the American, Brazilian teams are also sort of fielding really, really strong people. These people that through various relationships, a lot of these people will train in Japan, and so you run into them on sort of fairly regular basis. And of course, the Japanese team is full of all stars. You see them at the All Japan Championships on a regular basis as well. But to whatever extent you can, you try and sort of push that to one side and focus on the match that you have to fight next. And it can be distracting with the crowd around you, but ultimately, once you step onto the shiage or the place where you actually fight, most of that goes away, and it's just the person in front of you.
Yeah, it's interesting. Excuse me. It's interesting you talk about the person in front of you. One of the things that's unique about that type of competition, and of course it's true in boxing and in wrestling, is that it's you and this other person, and you're not out to beat the other person in the sense of like crossing the finish line before they do, and you beating them, something like
right.
Literally, and there's no teammate for either you or your opponent.
That's right.
There's just you, and there's something very invigorating, but and special about that type of competition.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, though, there is team competition in Kendo, and so you play. Yeah, you play matches of teams of 5, and so you play off down the line, put 1 against 1, 2 against 2, and so on down the line. and so I actually always felt most comfortable in team competition because I had people either side of me, and people that were relying on me to hold my end up, and so that added expectation, the weight of that expectation, actually it gave me more energy, it gave me more focus to go into a match.
And did you have any teachers that were particularly special to you in your time training?
Yeah, and this particular teacher I think is a favorite of many Australian kendoka. But his name is Shizawa Kunio. He was the head instructor at Japan Sports Science University, Nihon Taiku Daigaku. And he spent a year out in Australia. I couldn't even tell you when. It was many decades ago now. But and always brought or frequently brought students of his out to Australia to visit. And I don't know that there's a teacher who is more respected or more revered than him in Australian Kendo, and certainly I'm no exception in that regard.
And what is it about him that makes him so beloved?
I think his approach to life in general, he just seems to have a sort of knows when to be serious, but also knows when to have a laugh. And so, this is a guy who, you can talk at length with in terms of Kendo and martial philosophy. Happy to have a chat, and as soon as you step into the dojo, he's the sensei. He's the teacher, and one sort of reasonably harsh word from him can make me sort of question my life choices. But that his ability to kind of walk the walk and do what he says he'll do, you can't help but respect that level of commitment. It's difficult for me to describe, but it's not that he was the guy who won all the competitions. I think he won one or two in his time, but he was the guy who was always able to get his point across, always able to teach, always able to take someone, no matter where they were in their Kendo journey, and give them something that they could use. And I saw him do this time and again with any number of people. His ability to teach was unrivaled as far as I'm concerned.
On the subject of life choices, you, like many other Australians, actually decided at one point to move to London. Right. And I wanted to ask you about that. Was that with the intention of going for a short period of time, or was it in your mind a permanent move?
So I guess a semi-permanent move. I was born in London, and sort of moved to Australia when I was very young, maybe one or two. And so in many respects, it was sort of coming back, although I didn't remember much about it. At the time when I moved to London, I'd been living in Tokyo for maybe 5 years. And so it was actually a kind of a happy coincidence. There was a friend of mine working at eBay, and asked if I wanted a job with them in London, or asked whether I wanted to apply. And my wife, who is Japanese, has this sort of love affair with London as well, and so the opportunity for her to go and spend a lot of time in the West End seeing musicals and various other theatre was something that she couldn't pass up, and so at that point it became a very easy decision.
And so I can see from your profile online that you progressed steadily in your time at eBay, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about let's talk about the beginning and the end, maybe. What was your first job at eBay? So
my first job was a software development engineer in test, and so at that point, some people might sort of see it as a step down. I mean, I'd been in management positions and was sort of looking to sort of step up to senior management positions in the consulting work I was doing back in Tokyo, but I really wanted to sort of reconnect with my technical chops, and I wasn't quite ready to let those go yet. And so I sort of stepped in as a tester who was also a coder, and did that for a while. But inevitably I seem to get pushed back towards management. And this time I kind of stepped into a dev manager role, so leading a team of developers and testers. And did that for a little while, and then back into a test manager role, and ended up being the head of testing for European product development.
And do you bring to your role in managing any of the sort of examples or lessons that you've learned from your time studying Kendo?
I like to think so. I mean, I don't know that there's a one-to-one translation, but certainly in the way that you size up situations and that you deal with people. I like to think that the way I approach situations is kind of similar to the way I approach a Kendo match. You kind of have to rapidly size up what's going on, make decisions, and be ready for anything to happen and be able to adjust accordingly. Whether it be fighting one person or whether you're, pitching sort of an army against each other, the first thing that gets shot up is your battle plan. You have to be able to adjust and adapt and be flexible.
Speaking of flexibility, you left eBay relatively recently. I believe it was just this year, and you're now the UK managing director for the consultancy House of Test.
That's right.
Which has a presence in Denmark, South Africa, Sweden, Switzerland, and the UK.
Right.
And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kind of work House of Test does and what makes it unique. I noticed reading up about it that there's a striking line on the website which says, "We call bullshit on dehumanizing factory testing, bogus certification schemes," and it's very clear that this is not. I think I came across the term. Maybe it was in your writing or on the website. If you're a client who just wants meat bots to follow
right.
some scripts, we're not the consultancy for you.
Right. Yeah. So if I had to sort of put what we do into a sort of a nutshell description, it really is kind of professional irreverence. So we're people who will come in and size up a situation and tell it to you straight. If you're looking for people who will nod along and do everything that you tell them to, probably not the droids you're looking for. Where there is work to be done, obviously we're going to pitch in and do it. That's part of the job. But as software testers in particular, your role is to be able to speak truth to power, even when that's a difficult thing to do, even when that's not news that they want to hear, even when there's a risk that they might sort of shoot the messenger. And so being able to step into that space and, understand that, if they don't want to hear what we have to say, then we can fire a client. That's a nice position to be in. It's not a position that you want to be in necessarily, but when they know that you don't have a dog in the fight beyond helping them to do the best work they possibly can, I think that makes it a little easier. When my reputation hinges on me being able to enable a client to do better work, then obviously I have a vested interest in helping them do better. So even when I'm bringing them difficult information, if I can help them keep that in mind, then we have the ability to move forward.
And was that a hard decision to go from a big established company where you'd seen some success to you're with a group of people, but sort of being your own bosses?
Yes and no. So it was difficult in the sense that, it happened right around the same time that my daughter was born, my first child. And so starting a company, having a newborn simultaneously was I guess, an interesting choice, but a motivating one, I guess you could say. With eBay, I really enjoyed my time there, and there was certainly no dissatisfaction in terms of the reasons why I left. What I wanted to achieve at eBay, I probably would have necessitated me moving to the United States, and I wasn't really up for that at this point in time. So again, this became a kind of a natural progression for me. With House of Test, I mean, the people who are involved in the company are people that I've known for many, many years. I first met Henrik Anderson, Lou Perold, Carsten Feilberg at CAST, the Conference for the Association of Software Testing, back in, I think it was 2006, and I've been firm friends with them ever since. So really, when it came time to look at what was next, this seemed like a natural progression for me.
Well, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
That's wonderful to hear. I know that people, and there's a sort of pretty tight testing community, or sort of distribution of testing communities around the world. And I just wanted to point out there was an interesting coincidence. Recently, I interviewed Rob Lambert
Right.
For this podcast, and he has a book called Parent Brain,
Right.
where he talks about a kind of turnaround moment in his life, which was the birth of his first child. And he happens to, I mean, this happened later, not around the same time, but he happens to have struck off on his own as well, very recently, from the company he'd been with for years. And I just wanted to do a little callback, because that interview would be published before this one, and this wasn't a planned coincidence. One of the really interesting things about the testing world that I'm, mostly learning about through these interviews and reading books from testers on Leanpub, is that if you're a company, or you're even a startup, and you're looking to hire some testers, you have to be able to do some evaluation of your own in order to decide who to choose. And
yes.
What do you do? And you talk in your article in David Greenlee's book, Software Testing as a Martial Art, about, I'd never seen this term before, bullshido,
Right.
and McDojos.
Right.
And I believe there might be a connection, between that and criticism that you, I believe, have of bullshit certifications in
Right.
software skills and testing. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, is it a similar situation in testing where, there's just anybody can put up their shingle and say, hi, testers are us?
Yeah, there is unfortunately a kind of a low barrier to entry for software testing. And that is mostly because not other vocations tend not to recognize good testing when they see it. Unfortunately, there is so much sort of faux wisdom out there about what testing is, and most of that looks like writing test scripts or traceability matrices and heavyweight scripting and heavyweight documentation. And there's been a sort of a backlash against that from sort of the programming spheres of we can do our own testing, we can write our own automation, which is all fine, but I think there is something to be said about the discipline of software testing and the amount of work that it takes to get good at software testing, and so the problem that I have with certifications, at least in their current form, I'm not anti-certification, but I am sort of anti anything which will give you some sort of qualification or so-called qualification without proving that you've got the practical application behind you. The thing about current certifications is you can more or less study for a weekend and then take a multiple choice exam and call yourself a certified software tester, despite the fact that you might not have tested anything in your life. I could probably train someone over a day or two to pass this exam, despite the fact that they weren't a software tester or knew much about computers in general. And so in their current form, I don't think that they have a lot of practical value. And that's really the missing element, is that practical side. And unfortunately, for the people who are peddling certifications, that prac side doesn't scale very well. You can't sort of teach it en masse the same way that you can with a syllabus and a multiple choice exam. And so that's really where my issue is. My focus at the moment really is how do you teach the practical application of these skills? And
how do you do that?
That's a good question, and you do that by you learn software testing by testing software. I don't think there's any substitute for putting in the hours. The real key, I think, becomes how you sort of set up your own personal syllabus and how you find what it is that you need to be studying. And I think now there is a critical mass of software testing talent out there that you can tap into. Organizations like the Ministry of Testing, for example, have any amount of sort of free material that you can use to sort of start to hone your skills. And there are people that are available, on the various sort of Slack channels and various other sort of media that you can ask questions of. And as long as you're not a baby bird waiting to have sort of information sort of thrown at you, then people will go out of their way to help you. If you can demonstrate that you're doing your best to help yourself, people will be happy to help you. And I think that's the real key. There's probably space to formalize that a little bit. I would like to see software testing or software development apprenticeships set up where there are people who are recognized as sort of masters, if you like, in software development, software testing, various other vocations, product ownership, UX. I'd like to see, some sort of school set up where you could do, a year on each of the fundamentals of the different disciplines. If you could spend a year studying programming, then studying testing, studying UX, studying product ownership, and then start to specialize as a journey person, then you've got a solid fundamental, set of fundamentals and this interactional expertise between the different vocations. And no matter which you decide to specialize in, or if you decide to remain a generalist, then I think your ability to operate would be far greater than if you just chose one and stuck with it.
Yeah, I found your writing about this idea of apprenticeship to be very compelling. It's a really interesting idea. I'm curious, is part of the idea that just like in martial arts training, as long as you remain active or even otherwise, you retain a relationship with your teacher even if you move on to another school or to make your own school. In your concept of apprenticeship, would this be something where you would maintain a relationship with your quote unquote master even as you went through different jobs at different companies?
I think so. Certainly that's one of the things that I envisage, and certainly in terms of your growth, you ought to be able to sort of produce some sort of sort of formalized, sort of notarized history of what you've done, and sort of being able to call back on, here are the projects that I've worked on, and have them almost signed off by your teacher, your sensei, whatever you want to call them, as someone who can review the work that you've done and provide guidance or mentorship or coaching, whatever the case may call for. I think there is space for that. But equally importantly is the sort of the journey person part of the apprenticeship. I mean, the apprenticeship is not just learning the fundamentals; it's going out and applying them, and as importantly, misapplying them. People will learn their lessons imperfectly, and some of those imperfections will actually be useful. Some of those will be, added to the canon. That is the fundamental software testing, and that's good. The way that you learn from different people and synthesize different aspects and produce novelty. These are all things that I think are a little bit missing from the way that we approach learning about software development right now. There's no real sense of lifelong learning about software development, and I think that's a real shame.
Moving on to the next part of this interview, I'd like to talk a little bit about your book, Standout.
Sure.
You've interviewed a lot of people over the years, and I've got a question about that. I do want to ask you a sort of standard fun question. What's the worst thing you've ever seen an interviewee do? But before that, I was surprised by a section in your book about bad interviewers, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. What are one or two examples of poor interviewer behavior that interviewees can encounter, and what can they do to help themselves out in those situations?
Yeah, so the ones that I've most commonly encountered is the aggressive interviewer, the one who will try and sort of put you off balance or make you feel uncomfortable or make you feel like, you're unworthy. Like why? Tell me why you think you deserve a position here. Interviews can be stressful enough without sort of laying that on over the top of it, and so I think it's important to remember that as an interviewee. Whilst you're being interviewed, you're also interviewing the company. You're also doing your due diligence, and there's no reason for you to sort of sit in a room and be browbeaten. It's quite okay to take someone to task for being rude, and you'll probably find if you do that, then they'll probably sort of backpedal and sort of say, you've passed our test. We just wanted to see how you would handle pressure," which is bollocks, but that'll happen sometimes. I have heard of, but not seen, things like people being sat with the sun in their eyes, or on a chair that's lower or uncomfortable or broken somehow. Various other tactics to kind of assert dominance of the interviewer. And again, I find all of that particularly irksome and unnecessary. I think as an interviewer, what you're trying to do is understand what this person has done, what they're capable of, and what their potential is, and anything else is just a waste of time, really.
Yeah, thanks for that great answer. It's a really interesting thing that there is this convention that an interview ought to be some kind of ordeal,
right.
And in particular, a type of ordeal that they will never encounter in the course of the work you're hiring them to do.
Right.
If you're hiring someone to be a fire person, then yeah, sure, blare the sirens and make them run up and down the staircase and then operate some machinery. But, if you are going to simulate some kind of stressful environment, then simulate the kind of environment they might find themselves in for reals.
Right.
What is one of the, can you think of one or two of the funnier stories that you've seen people do in interviews?
Yeah, mostly it's people just being nervous. And probably the most memorable one for me was a guy who was so nervous that he broke wind in the elevator on the way up to the interview room. So that didn't endear him to me from the start. But he was also reasonably incurious, and so whatever question I asked him, his response was something along the lines of, "Well, I just do whatever the procedures say to do," I couldn't sort of get him to open up any more about sort of what his own ideas were. I'm not sure whether he was afraid to share those with me, but he obviously wanted to give the right answers. The other unfortunate thing about this particular gent was personal hygiene issues. When we went to shake hands, he put out this sort of filthy monster talon, which frightened the hell out of me. But I try and give people a pass when they're nervous. Everyone's nervous going into an interview, and so if you can set some sort of water cooler banter to just kind of get them relaxed, then that's great. In terms of funny stories, unfortunately, I don't have that many. Most of it's people forgetting stuff somewhere or tripping over or spilling water on themselves or those sorts of things, and then the sort of immediate look of panic on their face as they realize that, oh no, I've absolutely fluffed this interview, and you do whatever you can to kind of reassure them that no, we're not going to not hire someone because they've spilled a drink on themselves. It's cool, just chill out.
I guess I should have framed that question differently. I didn't mean to, sort of for us to sit here and talk about humiliating experiences people had. I just, sometimes people can do outrageous things, and it looks like you've been fortunate enough to mostly not encounter those.
There was one guy that now that you mention it, I asked him if he could do anything that he wanted, if he could have any job that he wanted. And this is a fairly standard question that I ask. If he could do anything he wanted, what would that be? and this was back in Melbourne, and he said, if I could do anything I wanted, I would open up a bakery in Akita-ken in the north of Japan. And me and my offsider sort of looked at each other and sort of asked him to open up about that a bit. And apparently he'd spent 6 months at a high school in Akita and had fell in love with the place and wanted nothing more than to go back there. And so I think we suggested that he ought to go and do that. We probably ended up not hiring him, I think.
Yeah, that's actually a very nice story. Someone who knows what they want to do is actually can be pretty hard to find in a way, and often I haven't done as much interviewing as you have, but sometimes you do find yourself in the situation where without trying to second guess them, you can actually see that maybe the job that they're interviewing for really isn't right for them,
right.
As much as they might think it is, and that as a responsible interviewer, it actually is partly your duty to make that distinction as well.
Right.
And so one of the interesting things, for the sort of readers that your book would be, really useful for, one of the catch-22s that people encounter when they're trying to start a career is, you can only apply if you've got experience.
Right.
But how do you get experience if you can't apply in the first place?
Yeah.
And what's your suggestion? So for given all the tools and things available to people in our day and age, what can you do if you're getting started or you're thinking about getting started and trying to plan your approach?
So my recommendation there would be to treat those sort of laundry list of requirements as guidelines and recommendations, not must-haves. Even if they say must-have, I would apply anyway. If nothing else, you're still getting interview experience. Beyond that, there are any number of sort of open source projects that you could work on. If you've got your own sort of GitHub account, then add code in there, for instance. Do what you can do to gain experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be paid employment. There's, if you look into volunteering, look into internships. There are other options out there. And so if you're having difficulty getting a foot in the door, that might be one way to go about it. I would also suggest looking at local meetups, and if you can, going to conferences, and just getting out there and meeting people who are in the business and can provide assistance, and starting to, if nothing else, build those networks as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting advice. I've seen it from a couple of other people as well. That just you can't. It will be very difficult for you to get started and to progress unless you're somewhat social,
right?
In developing your career, and that fortunately there are meetups that you can go to get started, and there are conferences that you can go to, and you can even start doing things like proposing talks and getting up there, and you don't need to approach it like you need to climb Everest on your first effort to climb a mountain.
Right.
You can go at your own pace, and you'll, just like anything else, you'll gradually become more comfortable with it and learn the ropes. But you do need to dip your toe in, at least to begin with.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember, I think, is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Small amounts of effort consistently will do a lot better than one major effort and then nothing again.
I wanted to call attention to a cause that you've been using your book to raise some money for. I hope I don't mispronounce the name, but it's Saving Linnea.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that just for a couple of minutes so people know about that?
Yeah, so a colleague of mine in Sweden, his daughter has a very aggressive form of cancer in the brain, and he is raising funds to give her treatment, which is reasonably expensive and experimental in nature and happening in Mexico. And of course, with my little one arriving in the world earlier this year, I can only imagine how difficult that must be for him and his family to go through. And I would like to think that were I in a similar situation, that people would do everything they can do to help. And so, knowing that and feeling that, I feel that this is perhaps the least I can do to help them out. I want to make sure that I give them every opportunity to save this little girl's life, and I hope that she comes out of the other side of that happy and healthy.
Thanks for that description. For anyone interested in learning more or potentially donating, you can go to savinglinea.com, and the name is spelled Linnea. So you decided to write a book at some point. What inspired that choice?
So really, looking at my career in testing, I'm surprised that thought didn't occur to me sooner. Actually, there's a lot that has changed over the years, but really the thing that has stayed the same is interviewing, and really that is that a lot of people, most people, I think, don't really know how to approach an interview or how to write a CV. And that stayed pretty constant for the sort of decade and a half that I've been in the business. And so what I wanted to do was kind of pull the kind of wisdom that I've accumulated over the years and put that into some sort of practical guide that could give people a leg up in terms of how do I structure my CV so that I get noticed? How do I approach an interview so that I stand a good choice of being hired? But also, how do I make sure that I know that this is the company I want to go and exchange my only finite resource for? And so that's what I did.
And why did you decide to use Leanpub as your platform?
So I wanted to use a platform where I could control the message, where I wasn't going to be told, cut this or add that. I wanted to really make sure that what I was putting out there was my own voice for starters. And beyond that, I'd seen a number of colleagues of mine also using Leanpub to good effect. And so it seemed like a natural choice, I guess.
Normally I would have just one more question for you, but I have a special bonus extra question I'll ask after. But if there were one thing we could build for you or one thing we could fix for you, if there's anything you can think of, what would that be?
Okay, good question. So for me, I think it would probably be able to, when using the web editor, be able to see the changes immediately reflected, in real time, as opposed to having to sort of generate the manuscript and then check it. I ended up using Atom as an editor to write the markdown, and then sort of copy paste that into the web editor. Because Atom was something that would allow me to sort of instantly see the layout that I was putting in place. And so even still, I found there was a little bit of sort of trial and error in terms of generating the manuscript and checking that the layout was exactly where I wanted it to be. That pages were breaking in the right places and so forth.
And
so
were you writing in Leanpub flavored Markdown?
I was, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for that. That's really interesting. I mean, for us to hear you're using an entirely different tool to then paste into Leanpub is a pretty good sign of a pain point for a certain use case. I believe that one of the reasons we currently make you generate the whole thing to create a preview and we don't have an instant version is that, what we're doing is we're set up for being able to do things for the most complicated case.
Right.
For the most complicated case, we can't really currently show you an instant rendering of what it will look like in, PDF. But it is something for us to consider that if somebody is, not, using, Leanpub flavored Markdown or Markua to make tables and all kinds of other things, then maybe we could do something around that. That's something we'll think about.
At some point, I'm probably going to write the obvious bookend to this book, which is interview on the other side of the table. So having something like that would make life so much easier.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. So my special bonus question is, in an hour, I'm going to be interviewing Jerry Weinberg.
Tell him I said hi.
Yeah. Oh, do you know him?
I know Jerry. I've met him a number of times. Did PSL with him a few years back. We have talked from time to time. So I'm very fond of Jerry.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. I just wanted to ask if there's one question you could get me to ask him for an interview. What do you think I should ask it? Either you'd be personally interested in hearing from him, or you think people might be interested in hearing from him.
Wow. I wish I had some time to think about this one, actually. But off the top of my head, something cheeky to ask him would be which he likes better, testing or programming.
Okay.
But he's also into sort of drywall construction, and so asking him his thoughts on that as it relates to software testing or software development would be probably an interesting thing to hear about.
I will definitely do that. So drywall construction in relation to software testing. Cool. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Ben, for that. I really appreciate it. And thanks for taking the time to do this interview. And thanks for being a Leanpub author.
Thanks for having me.